Our next speaker needs no introduction. He's the most prolific presenter of 9/11 evidence at Ground Zero, New York City, in the world. He's an architect for over 30 years. I'd like to introduce, and the founder and president of Architects for Engineers for 9/11Truth. He will also be, during his talk, he'll be Skyping someone in or Zooming someone in from Switzerland or from Germany, and he'll tell you about that. I'd like to introduce Richard Gage.
Thank you. I am truly humbled. Was that not like the best 9/11 delivery that you've ever heard? How can we go wrong now with voices and powerful people like that behind us? How about it? So let's get some justice. And for some of us, it starts fairly simply with a skyscraper called World Trade Center Building 7. How many of you know about Building 7? Okay, sorry, wrong place. How many of you don't know about Building 7? Not much about it. You heard a few things. There are some people in the room. This is fantastic. You are the audience, because all of us know a whole hell of a lot of people that don't know anything about Building 7. We start there. Why? Because no plane hit that building. Theoretically, according to the official story, nobody died in that building. And yet, it comes down really fast in the afternoon of 9/11. So we have 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. This building was 47 stories tall, easily the tallest building in most of our states. So if you're already familiar with some of these talking points, please get familiar with the rest of them so that you can deliver this message as simply as can be, as I will be delivering it. It's part of the World Trade Center. It was built in the 80s. It's 100 feet from the World Trade Center North Tower. Here it is standing tall. A few beams hit it from the World Trade Center, but NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, says this was not a factor, a significant factor in the collapse of this building. So what was? Let's first look at the building collapse. Here it is standing just fine, but 5:20 in the afternoon, the east penthouse goes down. And then 6 seconds later, this happens. Whoa, stop everything. I think I've seen this before, right? The old hotels in Las Vegas. What does NIST say about this? Oh, it came down due to normal office fires. Wait a minute, no skyscraper has ever collapsed due to normal office fires. Let's look at them. Well, these look like normal office fires. These are the largest fires we have photographic or video evidence of, though. They're few, they're small, and they're scattered. NIST says, well, these fires were raging on this floor 13 and 12 at the time of the collapse. Well, that turns out to not be true. Those fires were out, according to the photographic and video evidence, more than an hour before the collapse. NIST focuses their initiation of collapse theory on column 79, which is this column here, because they say, well, these fires that were raging at the time of the collapse heated up these 50-foot long beams that you see running left to right, push this girder off of its seat on this column 79, and that allowed the 13th floor to fall, the 12th to 12th on the 11th, and so on for 9 floors. weakening that column's bracing so that it just collapsed. And then the whole thing just collapsed. Again, the photographs and the videos show no fire burning for the hour before this collapse. Completely pulls the rug out from under them, which is only one of 12 rugs they have hid their evidence or their assumptions under, not the least of which that there is no precedent for a collapse of a high-rise steel frame skyscraper prior to 9/11. And there is a precedent for something else bringing down skyscrapers. What is it? It's called controlled demolition. And we have thousands or hundreds of examples from all across the country to make our comparison to Building 7. This is the most common way to bring down these buildings. They put shaped cutter charges in the columns and beams in the building, and they can bring it down quite effectively, as you see. So there are a set of features associated with controlled demolition. What are they? A sudden onset. Do we have a sudden onset of this building's collapse? Let's look and see. It's standing just fine. The east penthouse goes down 6 seconds later. The entire building drops suddenly. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse? Well, let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. And the entire penthouse, after the east penthouse falls, drops a half a second prior to the overall building. What does that mean? Well, that completely pulls the rug out from this theory that this collapse started on the east and then traveled uniformly across this building in just about 10 seconds. So this proves that that didn't happen. This alone, the video, proves that the columns had to have been taken out all at once in the core, followed a half a second later by the perimeter columns. And so we have some more backup to that story from one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, who will explain how this building could possibly end up in the middle of the footprint in a haystack pile. Maybe we're not quite convinced yet on the left, Building 7 on the right, a series of controlled demolitions. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper ever before 9/11. How do we do that? We have to remove those columns. Hey, there's 82 columns on each floor, and they have to be removed virtually all at once on at least 8 floors. And I'll explain that in a minute. That's 600 columns being removed virtually at once. Can the few small scattered fires that we've seen accomplish that? It's a very serious question. We're talking about these fires. Can they do that? I don't think so. 3,000 architects and engineers don't think so. The University of Alaska doesn't think so. The fire commissioners from the Munson Fire District don't think so. Physicists don't think so, who have clocked this collapse at free fall acceleration for a third of its 7-second fall. It's as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. It's as if 8 stories were instantly removed. Again, can fire do that? And result in the total dismemberment of the structural steel system, where columns and beams in a moment resisting structural steel frame are rigidly welded to each other. We wouldn't expect it to fall like a house of cards in 6 seconds. Buildings that fall naturally, we can see the building at the bottom, right? It's not, the columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. We don't have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions and see flashes of light. Oh, no evidence for explosives found, says Shyam Sunder of the NIST report, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain this collapse to the American people. Well, there are some witnesses. Here's Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic. He says, I know an explosion when I see it. It's like a boom, like he wanted to grab onto something. Barry Jennings, along with Michael Hess, the building had been evacuated after the towers were hit by the planes. But before the towers came down, they're trying to get to the 23rd floor, wondering, where is everybody? On their way up, they get blown around in the building. On their way down, they get blown around in the building. And they see all these explosions. He said he's walking over dead bodies. Fascinating. It completely betrays the official story. There are many witnesses of explosions. These firefighters are among them. Where you hear in this video, which you can see on our DVD, 9/11 explosive evidence, experts speak out. Hold up that DVD, Gail, would you? We have a lot of great information for you, and we have a few of them for you as well. The best DVD on the 9/11 forensic evidence that you've seen. How about what do the experts say? Well, here's one of the top one of the top controlled demolition experts in the country, in Europe, Danny Gioia. It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. Professional work, without a doubt. Now, this is unbiased experts. The controlled demolition industry experts in our country are beholden to the federal government, which might sway through political or financial obligations their objective opinion. But not so for 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE911Truth, like Kamal Obeid. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Many, many other quotes. Not time today. I just have about 10 more minutes, so we're going to go through it. But I want you to know that these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7 the afternoon of 9/11, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying, what you can't hear today because of our sound issues. Did you hear that? The building's coming down, flame and debris coming down. The building's going to blow up. Well, why is the building blowing up when it has a few small scattered fires? It's an unprecedented event that the building actually came down. Well, they were told that it had structural damage, that it was going to come down. That's a lot different than the building blowing up, and all of these witnesses like Kevin McPadden, who earlier was talking about explosions. He's held 6 blocks away from the building, and he's listening to a radio held in the hand of a Red Cross worker, and he hears a 3, 2, 1, and then he feels those explosions under his feet that make him want to grab onto something. So again, you've got to look at the DVD to get the gravity of these witnesses, including Jane Stanley of the BBC, who announced 20 minutes before it ever happened the unprecedented collapse of a steel frame building by weakening. They actually give us the reason, weakening when the structural towers went down. This is extraordinary. I mean, there's the building right behind her. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. What, does this make them psychic? Well, in a 1 hour's time, a lot more than we have here today, you can learn all of the 10 key characteristic features, including extreme heat, molten incendiary, proof of incendiaries, molten metal, iron and steel, melting, freely flying, rapidly ejected, laterally ejected structural steel sections out of the towers, and persistent extreme heat, not accountable by normal office fires whatsoever. It's all direct evidence of explosives. Fire does not create these features. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, the 3,000 now architects and engineers demanding a new 9/11 investigation, now along with the unanimous resolution passed by the brave fire commissioners at the Franklin Square Munson Fire District, who lost one of their own. He didn't say this today, but he said it before. You better believe that when the entire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. What else is making us unstoppable? One of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Hulsey, a chairperson of the Civil Engineering Department, University of Alaska Fairbanks, got a hold of, well, we got a hold of him, one of our members, and repeatedly asked him. He denied it at first. He said, no, man, I don't want to take this on. But he looked at it, and he's saying, gosh, we got a problem. No other tall steel frame building has collapsed due to fire. Maybe we should look at it, because we have lots of tall steel frame buildings similarly built that could collapse due to fire also. It has to be understood. So he examines the response to the fire loads. He rules out scenarios that couldn't cause the collapse. The goal here, to identify types of failures and locations that could have caused the collapse and contributed to the observable collapse. He has input data that is transparently observable by all, unlike NIST, who withheld their computer input data from their secret report, citing that it might jeopardize public safety. Well, wait a minute. How could it jeopardize public safety to withhold from the architects and engineers who were tasked with ensuring the public safety this valuable information so we can make sure our buildings are safe? So he simulates local structural response to fire loading, as NIST did in floor 13 using their assumptions. He examines those assumptions and the initiation of collapse theory by NIST. He simulates numerous fire failure scenarios that NIST had put forth, identifying what would lead to the total collapse. So there's an extraordinary series of drawings that are available in the 128-page report, which you can download from our website now, AE911Truth.org, in a report that's really going to change the landscape of architectural and engineering, most of whom, again, are completely unaware of the destruction, the third worst structural failure in modern history. And I'm particularly architects who have not received one bulletin on this collapse from our institute of 80,000 members, of which I'm a member. We're just shocked when we go out and we find that most of them are completely uninformed. So the modeling also reveals here that one of the results of NIST, they made the right exterior structure, for instance, infinitely stiff. So all of the heat expansion would move all of those elements to the left, pushing that girder off of its seat. And the girder had shear studs. It couldn't have been pushed off of its seat, but they ignore those shear studs. The girder had stiffeners. They ignore those stiffeners, and the movement goes to the left. But what does Professor Hulsey find when he transparently, with accurate data, it doesn't do that. The stiff part of this building is at the elevator core. It's moving that bowing out that exterior steel frame. On and on and on, he disproves one assumption after another by NIST, including the fact that even if that girder did heat up, it would expand and get trapped behind the side plate that is welded onto this wide flange column 79. The 13th floor couldn't have busted broken by shear force the 12th floor, even if it did fall. There never would have been a progressive collapse. So what are these findings? Well, they overestimated the exterior wall rigidity. The exterior walls were flexible, not stiff, and the movement of the seat was in the opposite direction, as we just talked about. The NIST assumptions are that the shear connections weren't there, but they were there. They assumed that they were broken, but they couldn't have been. NIST assumed the bolts fastening the girder to its seats were broken. And NIST assumes that columns 79, 80, and 81 failed in an internal cascading collapse on the east side. But what is found here is that they didn't fail. Even if you use all of NIST's incorrect, invalid, assumptions, he can't get the building to fail at all. So he does something extraordinary. He takes out more columns, like 8 of them. What happens when he does that? Well, gosh, you take out 8 of those columns and all of a sudden the building does begin to fail, but it tips over. Looks nothing like the collapse that you just saw. So what does he do next? He says, gosh, how do we get this building to fail like the video shows? Well, let's see. Here's the computer model. What did he have to do in order to facilitate this? An isolated series of removal of columns under the east penthouse, a separate event. And then removing 600 columns all at once. By God, the building comes down at free fall acceleration. So what are the essential findings? Fire did not cause the collapse of this building. The temperatures were not hot enough to cause weakening of the structural steel. Thermal expansion did not result in the loss of support of the beams and girders. The building did not experience a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of its columns, 600 of them. And so that's why we have the comparison side by side where you see NIST on the right, their computer model, which proves their theory, but stops just 2 seconds after it starts, after it begins to crumple up like a beer can, looking nothing like the video of the collapse in the middle, and showing 400 structural steel connections failing every second, and they still can't get it to behave like the University of Alaska did. Yes, the Professor Halsey's model is indeed mimicking exactly what's going on in the building, and that's why we have 3,000 architects and engineers. And that's why we want you to show this to every architect and engineer you can find, everybody else that you know, because then people are open to the World Trade Center towers, and which exhibit, by the way, all 10 key characteristic and very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition, direct evidence by explosives. Again, fire not creating these features, particularly the near free fall acceleration of these buildings. So I want to show you how fast these buildings come down. Here's 5 seconds, 7 seconds. In about a dozen seconds, both of these towers are completely shattered, their structure from top to bottom. And through what? Through the incredible steel structure, which is mostly steel. There's more steel on this facade than glass.